you're looking for amusing stories. I think this is an amusing story. There were 7 of us in the car, plus the cat.
Plus the cat.
Yeah, because the boys wouldn't go without the cat. Cool. So we are driving parallel to the Zhytomyr road through the woods, and then dropping down and going to Vinica, and then. But the funny part was that the cat liked lying on the windowsill of the driver's side of the car. Okay. So everybody who's passing our car thinks that the cat is driving the car, because that's what it looks like. The cat is stretched out, looking as though it's driving the car. I mean, I'd happily live here all the time if I didn't have to look after my house or my family outside Ukraine, because it's a good place to live.
Welcome to Storytelling Ukraine, the podcast of amazing stories. Make sure to listen till the end, because the best stories are told when the guests are about to leave, as we all know. Now, I'm very happy to welcome Stephen Tupper to our podcast today. Hello, Stephen.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Well, before we jump right to the stories about Ukraine, your stories of Ukraine, let's create some context. So how did it happen that you actually have Ukraine stories to share?
Well, I'm an international consultant, and I've been working on various projects that are funded by the British government, the Americans, the EU, in, I think, 62 countries, of which Ukraine happens to be one, the best. Yeah. Ukraine, I started working here in 2008, and I've had a series of projects which have in Ukraine, which are related to various sectors, and these days, of course, the reconstruction and repair of damaged assets.
Absolutely. So you have been in and out of Ukraine since 2008, or you actually lived here for some time?
Oh, it's a very unusual situation. I decided in 2010 that Britain was too far over to the left to be flying all the time around Asia, and Kiev is more central. So I was, even when I wasn't working in Ukraine, I was living in Irpin and flying out to, say, Bangladesh or Australia, because it's more logical. It's a more logical option from a logistic point of view.
Right, excellent. That's basically that was a good choice up to a certain point.
Yeah,
and that's when we move to the stories. So when you come back to the UK and you meet with friends or family, and they ask you, so what's it like? What are your stories that you sort of give them the feeling of what you're doing?
Well, first of all, I would say that it's extremely difficult for anybody who lives outside of Ukraine to understand on a subliminal, emotional level what is happening in Ukraine. Of course, there's lots of news about the war and so on. Not so much about anything else at the moment, but the picture of Ukraine is dominated by the war, by the stories of people who have come, if I'm talking about Britain, who have come to the UK to live because they're evacuated. But that still isn't an accurate picture. For example, most of my relatives imagine that I am sitting here in Ukraine, and every minute of the day a rocket is headed in my direction, and I have to explain to them that no, the air raid warning covers a large territory, and the chances of being hit in a city like Kiev with 3 million buildings in it are pretty small. But everybody has a rather exaggerated view of what is happening in Ukraine, generalized. And of course, we all know there are areas that have been completely destroyed, but generally speaking, everybody thinks that the whole of Ukraine looks like Bakhmut.
I see. Well, that's the stories that people get from the news, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's one of the reasons why we have this podcast, just to tell a different story.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the war dominates all aspects of Ukrainian life today. And how did the war start for you?
Well, the war started for me. I was living in Irpin, and I had just found, and I got tired of driving an hour and a half every day each way to get in and out of Kiev. So I had found, for me, an ideal apartment next to the Maidan. And so, having been there only for a fortnight, I wake up one morning to hear, of course, the sounds of explosions and the sirens. I was already packed. Yeah, I already had an emergency go-to bag. So I immediately got up and then thought about what to do next. And of course, everybody's rushing onto the main roads to get out, to go west. and I have family in Irpin, so I think I must be the only person dumb enough to go from Kiev to Irpin on the first day of the war. Yeah, and as I got there, in fact, I got over the bridge, and about 10 minutes after I got over the bridge went, of course, yes, and we ended up with my family stuck in Irpin for a while, until we could get out. And I look at these things perhaps in a rather casual manner, because this is not my first war. Yes, I was in Tbilisi in 2008, and I was also in Beirut in the 1980s during the civil war there. So perhaps I have a more, I wouldn't say casual, a more balanced attitude to what is happening at the time. So we stayed in Irpin for a while, and then eventually we got out. You're looking for amusing stories. I think this is an amusing story. There were 7 of us in the car, plus the cat.
Plus the cat.
Yeah, because the boys wouldn't go without the cat. So we are driving parallel to the Zhytomyr road through the woods, and then dropping down and going to Vinica, and then. But the funny part was that the cat liked lying on the windowsill of the driver's side of the car. Okay. So everybody who's passing our car thinks that the cat is driving the car, because that's what it looks like. The cat is stretched out, looking as though it's driving the car.
Excellent.
So we went to Lviv for a couple of months, and then came back to Irpin and Kiev, because my nephew works for Oblenergo, and he needed to restore all of the power networks around Bucha and Kostomel and such like. So the war was interesting. It still is interesting. But I decided to stay because in our project we have about 140 Ukrainian staff, and I don't actually like the idea of leaving them behind. Yes. Yeah. Officers shouldn't run away from the front, leaving their troops when the enemy advances, yes? But also because I began to raise money from my own funds and from friends to do all sorts of small projects, including reconstruction projects, and that's basically what I did for the first year of the war. And it was great because it was so much faster than doing it through governments. You know, as I've got a clinic that needs new windows. I'm not going to write terms of reference for a bunch of windows. I'm going to go down to Epicenter, having measured the window, and get it done.
And get it done, yeah. So the private initiative always works faster and more efficiently.
Yes, it does. I'm not sure about more efficiency. I will give the government the benefit of the doubt sometimes, but I mean, it certainly works faster. So I was doing that, and we ended up with a lot of projects which were, I have friends in Zhytomyr who I helped finance making winter underwear for the army. And also, I don't know what the English for burjuika is, a log stove, for people who had lost their heating supply, etc. And then I got on to a really big flagship project in Vinica, where there's a wonderful centre called Logo Club, which was designed to help children with speech difficulties. And they are now providing services to children with special needs, which are autism, mutism, ADHD, all of the socio-psychological problems that children have. And I think at the moment they've treated 4,700 children. That's a lot. So, I mean, I and my friends have been financing getting that rolling.
Great. We are entering the 3rd year of the war.
Yes.
And do you have the feeling that people in general and the country as a whole sort of got used to it? What does it feel like living in the country with the active war of attrition going on?
I think that answer has to be, I don't think there's a common answer for that, because some people have adapted to it. Some people have adapted to it. I mean, I was in Kryvyi Rih a couple of months ago, and I was talking to IDPs who were living in various schools, etc., about their attitude to the war. They haven't got used to it because they all want to go home. Sure. And that's particularly the case with the elderly who have been living. Who've been living in their own communities. I mean, I'm sorry to say there was one woman there who actually survived the whole of the German occupation from 1941 to 1944, and now finds herself again evacuated. But I think a lot of people have got used to it. I wouldn't say used to it, they've adapted to it. So it's not as though they take it for granted, but they don't expect conditions to be normal. Or we can say that the war is the normal condition for some of these people. And they all react differently, of course. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's absolutely astonishing how the Ukrainians just keep going. You know, it's... I'm from Britain, so we would say the Ukrainians raised 2 fingers to Russia. The Americans would say they'd raised 1 middle finger, yes. But the sentiment is exactly the same. So I'm really impressed by the way that the Ukrainians have taken this in their stride. It is terrible. I've lost friends who try and help their families, etc. But I don't think anybody complains in the sense of thinking that it's not worth fighting.
And that's good news.
That's brilliant news. That's brilliant news because in other conflicts there is always going to be some sort of metal fatigue after a certain amount of time, but in Ukraine it's still very good.
We're made of good metal, I suppose.
Titanium.
Okay. Titanium.
Wolfram, exactly.
Exactly, right. Let's go back a little to the pre-war years. Because, you know, again, war is important, and that's something that stands out these days, and that's something that people hear from the news all the time. But Ukraine is much more than just the war, and I'm sure that, you know, there are some stories that stand out from your previous experience of living and experiencing Ukraine. Yeah. So if you think about these stories, like something that you would tell your friends is very, you know, enlightening, illustrative about Ukraine, like...
Well, I mean, of course, there was a whole different vector in the development of Ukraine before the war took place. I was working at one time as the head of a group which was looking at investment projects. And we were working with, I think, I apologize if I'm wrong, it was 487 hromadas we were working with on their little investment projects. And they were all interesting and innovative. So it's a very innovative people, the Ukrainians are. So they're always looking for ways of doing things in perhaps a non-standard manner, not necessarily the most efficient manner, but they were always looking for something new to do.
Right.
And the results that they produced, for example, in some projects we were involved in or colleagues were involved in, were very impressive. I mean, the pace of change in Ukraine was really very substantial, really very substantial. And I look at, for example, the excellent industrial park which they set up in Zhytomyr, which makes furniture and everything connected with wood, and which I wish they would export to Bulgaria because I would buy it for my own home in Bulgaria. So there's a lot of interesting things going on, and people here learn very, very quickly. Yeah, you don't have to spell everything out to them. So we would be working with people in hromadas who doesn't have any experience of investment, and we gave them training, and they would pick up very fast, very fast. I'd say human capital here is extremely high quality.
Do you have some like specific stories from these hromadas where you would see, you know, some brilliant initiative, something that stands out?
Oh, I mean, the projects themselves were not always particularly innovative or interesting. For example, the tourism projects, the crafts projects, but there were a lot of projects which were related to energy saving, to producing better quality educational materials, etc. As I say, there were just hundreds of hromadas, and it's not as though each hромada had only one project, yes?
Yeah.
So it's difficult for me to single out a single one, for example, because I've seen so many good tourism development projects or projects which are related to maintaining national cultural traditions, etc., particularly in Western Ukraine, in Zhovka, for example. So I wouldn't know where to start by saying what's a good project, because there are too many of them.
I see. So that's part of your work, part of what you've been doing here in Ukraine. But what about daily life? What about like day-to-day living in Ukraine, how is it different, for example, from living in Britain? You know, some like very down-to-earth, mundane things.
Well, I would have said a few years ago that it's much cheaper living in Ukraine than in Britain, but unfortunately the prices have all gone up over the years.
Right.
What is different in Ukraine? What is different in Ukraine? That's an extremely difficult question to answer. What's different is, of course, that, for example, my relatives will go to a supermarket and buy something which is enough for their household for 2 or 3 days. They won't be taking the SUV and loading it up into massive freezers, etc. So the idea that things have to be fresh is also part of Ukraine culture. And you won't find anybody in Britain that I know of who actually grows anything of their own. Yeah. So let's face it, if I remember rightly, in the Soviet Union as a whole, the urban population only outnumbered the rural population in the late 60s, whereas in Britain, of course, it was 100 years before that. So this is an agrarian oriented in some sense, not completely rural, but it has a much bigger agrarian outlook, I would say.
And background too. So
and background as
people,
well.
you know, still have this in their like memory of how to work the land and grow the vegetables at least.
I mean, I can be. I'm sorry, I have to compare Ukrainian rural areas with the rural areas of some certain neighbours. Yes,
Yes.
and you're miles ahead. Yeah, you can go into a Ukrainian village and you will see the houses are neat. What is English for zabor? The fences are neat and all the rest of it, which is not the case elsewhere.
Right.
So this is also a sense of pride.
Yeah.
Yeah, very proud people.
What is one thing that, in your opinion, the whole world gets wrong about Ukraine?
10 years ago, everybody got it wrong because they thought that Ukraine was part of Russia, yes?
Yes.
And thank God for that, that has disappeared, yes?
Yes.
At the moment, there's a rather simplistic view of Ukraine because it's like the old cowboy films that the baddie always wears the black hat, says he who has a black hat, and the goodies always wear the white ones. The situation is much more nuanced because Ukraine does have its problems, corruption being one of them, unfortunately. So people have too simplistic a view of Ukraine sometimes. I notice, for example, in the United States, the Republicans tend to be more black hat in relation to Ukraine, the Democrats more white hat. But generally speaking, Ukraine is 40 million people, all of whom have different attitudes to life and different moral backbone, I suppose. So people tend to paint things black and white.
Yeah.
In relation to Ukraine. For me, it's black and white. Yes, because there's one aggressor and one defender, so that's black and white. Yeah. But within that, people don't really have such a nuanced view of what is going on in Ukraine.
Right. In the similar line of reasoning, what is one thing that the Ukrainians get wrong about themselves?
Oh, you really do enjoy asking difficult questions, don't you?
Yes, I love asking.
Yeah, I know. So you've just switched from asking me what 300 million Americans think of Ukraine to what 40 million Ukrainians think of America, yes?
Exactly, yes.
No, I think Ukrainians expect that the rest of the world will support them. I think the rest of the world should, but you cannot treat it as an automatic expectation, unfortunately. It's not by default. I would say the ordinary population, for example, in Britain are very pro-Ukrainian, but that doesn't mean to say that the supply of generosity or the supply of enthusiasm is bottomless, unfortunately. So I think sometimes the expectations from Ukraine don't take into account our domestic agenda issues. Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, we also have problems balancing the budget.
True. Very true.
But I mean, generally, I think Europe is clearly going to continue to support Ukraine. Yeah. I mean, it's the old. Do you remember the old joke? visit the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union visits you.
That's a good one.
Yeah, exactly. So,
That's a good one, really good one.
yeah.
If you look back at all the time you've lived in Ukraine, you've visited Ukraine, you've stayed and lived here since 2008, what is one or story, or maybe a couple of stories that really stand out, and without like something that basically, like by default, you think about Ukraine and maybe some specific people, specific situations that really stand out. Without these stories, this picture of Ukraine in your mind wouldn't be full. Do you have anything like that? Some really vivid stuff?
Yes, I do. I mean, I've seen so many. Well, I rephrase it. I have met so many wonderful people and been to so many wonderful places in Ukraine that when I think back what I remember about Ukraine, these little cameos, yes?
Yes.
For example, I will remember the cameo of being in Ternopil, driving for miles and miles to the middle of nowhere, and then having a picnic in the middle of nowhere, being eaten alive by mosquitoes while we were having the picnic. But I will remember that, yes?
Yes.
And I will remember going to look at to the Dniester Canyon to look at where, and I will always remember walking around Lviv, which is absolutely stunning city, yes?
Yes.
So there's, or even just going out into the woods outside of Irpin and doing shashlik with the family.
Yeah.
These are all small pleasures, but they mean a lot.
Yes. So little bits and pieces of experience in Ukraine and...
Yeah, absolutely. I cannot... One thing I would say about Ukraine, I have never experienced any negative reaction to me personally in Ukraine. I think Ukrainians are generally a pretty friendly bunch. I cannot say the same for when I travel around Russia, because they seem to have this inferiority complex, let's call it what it is.
Yes.
But in Ukraine, people are friendly. People will go out of your way to help you. If you help them first, then there's no limit. Yes, you'll have to survive Hrenavucha and God knows what else, and Shkvarki, but you will always be welcoming. I've never been in a situation where somebody has been unwelcoming to me, except once when I spoke Russian in Chernivtsi and the sales assistant told me off for not speaking Ukrainian. And I said, well, okay, dear, then why don't you go and learn English, because I'm from Britain. And then we had a laugh about it, yes?
Right.
So people are friendly and open. Yeah. I mean, I'd happily live here all the time if I didn't have to look after my house or my family outside Ukraine, because it's a good place to live, even in wartime.
Even in wartime.
Even in wartime.
That's really important to highlight. But even in wartime, it's a good place to live.
Exactly. Even in wartime, okay, it's tough in some ways, when the electricity goes off, for example.
Yeah.
But it's still a nice place to live, even in wartime.
That's a really nice conclusion.
Well, I'm not saying it's really nice to live in Bakhmut,
Yeah.
but in those areas which haven't been pummeled by Russian artillery, it's a good country to live in.
Nice.
I'm looking for ways to come back.
If you were to write a book about Ukraine, what would be the title?
Well, unfortunately, Milan Kundera has already borrowed The Unbearable Lightness of Being, yes.
Right.
So we have to find another name, and it somehow has to combine the concepts of pride, stubbornness, and openness. So perhaps we need something like a Jane Austen, yes? Mm-hmm. Yes. Pride and openness rather than pride and prejudice.
Pride and openness.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And let's hope that one day you will write this book, at least in stories that you will tell, because I'm sure that...
I've got lots of stories to tell.
Exactly.
At the moment, the key task is to do the reconstruction work I'm doing. I don't have time for writing anything.
Right.
It's bricks and mortar. We've got to get the country back on its feet.
Exactly. Exactly.
And although there are lots of discussions with international organizations and donors, I look at Irpin. When I go back, I was there on Friday, and I see that there are a lot of discussions about what needs to be done, But while the discussions are taking place, the Ukrainians are already doing it.
Right. Well, because we can't wait.
Yeah, exactly. You can't wait.
We can't wait. Stephen, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate this, and thank you so much for everything you're doing for Ukraine.
Well, I try. I get a kick out of doing something nice, yes. So when I'm working with Logo Club in Vinica, and we are doing the new sensory room, etc., and we are equipping it and decorating it, etc., I get a kick out of what I see from the kids. Yes.
Yeah.
I get a kick out of that. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. And dear friends, thank you for staying with us, and thank you for sharing your time. Please hit the subscribe button. It's very important for us. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to follow this on YouTube, on Spotify. Subscribe, like, share. Also, we have a Patreon page and Buy Me a Coffee. All the links will be in the description to this podcast. Let's make this a world of stories and not of headlines. See you next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Small stories, not big print.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Not at all.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, it's a pleasure for me as well.